Okay, so not exactly conventional, but before we go into the data center, I wanted to just show you what we're going to be starting with. So this hardened repository is going to feature 6 different hard drives. Again, this is just a server that I had available, and I really wanted to go through the drill of doing it as a physical system versus a virtual machine. So these 6 hard drives here are going to compose the hardened repository. But this one over here, see if I can get you here, this one is an SSD. Okay, so this one's going to actually be the operating system drive. So it's a little bit smaller, but again, your hardware may vary. It's very important not to have this as a virtual machine for the hardened repository, right? So we've got a couple different things going on, which we'll go over in the data center. Networking will be back here. Out of band management will start there. Pretty standard configuration, and by the way, do not deploy servers on top of desks, but I just wanted to show you what I'm starting with here, where the hardened repository will take these 6 drives. I'll put a RAID implementation in on those, right, and then you're going to be balancing performance and capacity with that, and then I'm going to have the operating system here. If I had 2, I could even have a separate RAID for the OS, but I'm going to be okay for this scenario with this. But I wanted to start with the look and feel right here. Okay, so after I've prepared the actual physical server, you saw the hard drives last, I want to get ready to install Linux. And we have the opportunity to do fast cloning or use this storage efficiency on the backup repository. If you're not familiar with it, it's available on a couple of different platforms here. But this is a storage efficiency that helps out in a number of different ways. And if you're not familiar with it, check out Fast Clone in the user guide. But simply put, this is a storage efficiency that it's not deduplication, but it prevents data duplication. Okay, so the thought here is in some of these backup copies, merges, and synthetic fulls, all these different storage things where it's reading and potentially writing the same data, we can use the file system to take a lot of this work off. So this is a really good advantage to combine with the hardened repository. So if you're not familiar with this part, check out Fast Clone in the user guide. Now, one thing I want to highlight is down here, 2 things have to happen, and we'll get to this once we install Linux, is the file system is XFS. And the other thing I want to highlight is that it has these supported distributions. So for this reason, I'm going to use Ubuntu 20.04 LTS. So that's over here. All right, so when you go to download Linux, and in my example, I'm going to go with 20.04.3 LTS focal fossa. And I'm going to, you have a choice right here, a desktop image and a server image. Now, I don't like the window manager and all those other things for this use case of, hardened repository, so I've chosen the server install image, this one here. Now, I've already downloaded that ISO, so what I'm actually going to do now is I'm going to blast an old USB that I've got here. And so let me find this ISO file here. Yeah, I'm going to take an ISO and let's make an image from it. So if you're not familiar with this tool, by the way, this is Rufus, and it is a really good way to take an ISO here and you just browse. I've downloaded, there it is, Ubuntu 20.04, and so it's going to take, this is just an old Veeam USB that we used to distribute, and just going to take these defaults and it's just going to whack it as an ISO image mode, right? So if you're not familiar with this now, I'm going to just basically take this ISO image here, and it's going to be a couple of warnings, but yes, this should be fine. Yep, it's going to destroy that USB, and it should be pretty quick. Now you can also, right, I'm probably, when I rack and stack this server, I'm probably going to use the DRAC, that Dell EMC remote management hardware interface. You could use it a number of different ways. I know some people would burn it to CD, but honestly, new servers nowadays don't even have CD or DVD media. So those remote management tools or USB boot is the way to go. I probably am going to use the DRAC and the USB. Now the reason why is just because once it's on USB, it's just usually a little bit quicker. But it's honestly not that important on Linux now that I think about it, because Windows will go a little bit slower just because it's bigger. But this is only like a I think it's 1 gigabyte, this whole file, so it's pretty quick. But one thing I'll highlight while Rufus is making a bootable USB for me is, again, when you think about this server interface, this is really important right here. It will not install a GUI or a window manager. Now, I'm going to walk you through that, right? I do a lot better myself when I have a window manager in Linux, but again, if you're watching this workshop video, you're probably here because you don't have all the Linux skills that you might need, or at least you want to see it done to implement it in your own environment. But it's important to read through the fast clone information, because this is not required for the hardened repository. I should emphasize this, fast clone. But this storage efficiency you really should consider having for the hardened repository. So to combine this storage efficiency that comes with fast clone with the capability of the hardened repository, this is a really good combination. So my recommendation is to do both, and that's the way we're going to walk this workshop video through. I'm going to let Rufus finish up, but at the end of the day here, I'm going to have a USB that has Ubuntu 20.04.3 Focal Fossa on it for the install on the next step. Okay, now before I go and rack and stack the server and install Linux to then configure the hardened repository, there are two things I want to draw your attention to that I'll walk through real quick. And one is to check out the Help Center and then read the latest on the hardened repository here. Now this requires Linux, and this is what the whole objective of the workshop will be here for this video. But when we do this, we have an opportunity to implement fast clone. Now fast clone is a storage efficiency that comes at no additional cost with deploying Veeam. Now this is really interesting when you combine the resiliency of the immutability configuration on the hardened repository with what fast clone brings. Now fast clone is a storage efficiency. It's available on a number of different properties or operating systems here. We're going to put it on Linux, but to explain what fast clone is, it's a storage efficiency that's not deduplication, but it prevents data duplication. All right. So what I mean by that is anytime there's a piece of data that's to be read and then written, and if it already exists on that volume, it'll be that storage efficiency. Internally, I like to call it no dupe, but specifically for Veeam operations, here's where it can help you. So this is a storage efficiency that you can use at no additional cost, by the way, and it'll help performance, so it's really, really helpful. Now when you want to consider it for Linux, so a couple things. We have to use the XFS file system, and most importantly, we would need to be on this supported distribution of Linux. And I'm going to go with Ubuntu. That's where I have the most expertise, but you know, the bigger supported list of Veeam Linux capabilities supports more than just this, but for the fast clone capability, this is also the important thing. And we're going to come back to this also when we configure the repository, but right from the start I want to highlight why we go to Ubuntu 20.04.3 LTS, long-term servicing. And then the next question is, do you want the desktop image or the server install image? I'm going to install in the workshop video this server install image. This does not have a graphical user interface. So if you think about the point and the reason of having a hardened repository with Veeam backups, you don't want to have you don't want to have an extra footprint. I'll admit it's a lot easier when you have a GUI and you can do stuff and you have a browser and all those other things. But that's not the point of what we're going to be doing here with the hardened repository. So the workshop, as I continue through, will go with this image, and it's not big. It's like a 1.2 gig file, right? So just right off the bat, you can see it's a pretty efficient file compared to the desktop, which is nearly 3 times the size. So just starting small and explicit from the beginning is a good idea here. Now I'm going to either use this ISO directly and mount it through the hardware management console, or you can use one of those tools like Rufus to basically convert the ISO to a bootable USB.
So you have some flexibility, or you could actually burn the ISO to an optical media, but most new servers don't do that nowadays. But again, you have some flexibility. Get this ISO, get it bootable, and then we'll continue on to the next step.
Okay, so in this video, I'm going to prepare for the OS installation, but in order to do that, I want to walk you through what I'm planning to do in regards to the installation. So I've taken the server over to the data center. So there it is sitting on top of the rack. I do have the bezel out, and this area here is a colo that we keep our stuff in. I share it with the Veeam Tech Support group, and I pulled up the crash cart, and we're getting ready to do the installation. But let's go over a few of those points before we go into it. Now, I am going to use the iDRAC to do the installation. That's a great way, first of all, to record it for you here in this video, but then secondly, it's a great out-of-band management tool, but I'm going to unplug that actually. In fact, I remember Anton in the digest even said, you know, having a webcam is a really good kind of type of out-of-band air gap monitoring system. And I don't really like these kind of default things that are sitting there. So for this use case, I am going to unplug it later. So this particular iDRAC, I'm going to go into it on this IP 10.0.22.30, and it'll go away. So when I go to the next slide, you'll see that I have a very similar IP for the actual Ubuntu IP, but this will go away because you don't usually use that on a separate on the same network as your OS. Now I did update the server firmware. I think that's a very good idea. This is an older server, but never underestimate the value of a good firmware update, especially if you're deploying new. So I want to show you now kind of some other information, and some of this isn't standard, so I want to explain this before I get into this. So this is some of the information I've collected that I'm going to need before the installation. So this particular Ubuntu server is going to have a static IP. So you see it's 10.0.20.31, and keep in mind that back here, right, we had 10.0.22.30. So 10.0.22.31 is the IP of the actual Ubuntu server, keeping in mind that the DRAC will go away. And Ubuntu, when you do the install, and you'll see me mess this up, but it wants the IP in a certain format as well as the subnet mask, right? So I wrote it over there in CIDR format. So I have that so I don't forget it, but I'm sure I will. Now, you'll also see me put in a default gateway, but I'm going to take that away after the install because, again, I want to do a set of updates once with the internet, but then ongoing, I don't want this thing connected to the internet. So that's one way you can take it away. Another angle is you could just put it on a different interface that does have internet and then take that away at some point in time. A couple of different ways, but for me, I'm just going to drop the gateway from the config and such. Now, I am going to set up DNS for now, so that 20.2 will be the DNS forwarder. And then this particular server does have a VLAN that it will need to get onto the network, so that's not common either. So you'll see me do that in the install, and of course I'll probably mess that up too, but I'll get it right. The thought here is sometimes you might have a VLAN, sometimes you won't. It's actually a lot easier if you don't, but in this example I am. I'm not saying you need that, it's just kind of came with the port, if you know what I mean. And then I've also got the name that this server will be, tpm0lvhr01.aperturelabs.biz. And the profile page, when you set up the name and username, I'm going to set up console user VHR1 and Vtron. Those are be the two kind of names and accounts that I put up. And then the last thing I'm going to do, which is also not necessarily common, but I want to explain it now, is, and you might remember that there were the two different arrays, right? There was the smaller SSD, which is where the OS is going to go, and then the array of larger rotational drives. That's where the Veeam hardened repository, the VHR, is going to go. That is going to be formatted XFS, but a lot of times people will put that in MNT or a mount path. I'm actually going to explicitly mount it as VHR01 because it's special and I want to know explicitly where it is. I don't personally want it intermixed with everything else that might be mounted to the server or other drives that came with it. Again, your mileage may vary, but I just want to explain these things that aren't necessarily
most standard of standards that'll make sense when I go through the install. All right, so let's go ahead and start that install just now. Okay, so now we're in the lab, and I am using the iDRAC, which is that integrated hardware management system. One thing I'll tell you, this is an older system, but no matter what you're using, I do recommend doing a BIOS upgrade. This is the latest and greatest for this server, these hardware platforms, and where I left off, I just did, you might recognize that if you've used some of the older servers of this type. I just initialized the drives. And I have the remote console running and it's booting up, and I am mapped into the ISO of Ubuntu 20.04. So we're going to let this boot, and during uninteresting parts of the video or the boot or installation process, I'm going to pause, right, just so you don't wait and watch. But I'm letting the server boot up, and that media is going to be what comes up next through the iDRAC. Now you could use Rufus to burn an ISO, you could use, you could put it on optical media, you could use network boot, all kinds of other ways to do it, but I am using this hardware controller for this boot. So I'll let this boot up and we'll get to the install just now. All right, here we go. It does see that, there it is, that is Ubuntu. So it is booting from the ISO. And let's go ahead and get this started. I'm just going to hit enter. And let's let this installer get started for us here. And now one thing you might notice during your install versus this one is the discovery, the hardware, this part of the install may look different. But again, this is how it looks for me, and modern systems may behave different. There might be different messages. So don't get too wrapped around the axle about what yours may look like specifically compared to this. Okay, here we are. So let's, I vote for English. Let's do that. Keyboard looks good. Done. Okay. Okay. So you might have recalled in the preset that I was going to do a specific network configuration. Now, those of you familiar with Linux and such can see I only have one interface that's actually indeed connected. So again, this is a lab, but I want to just keep it as explicit as possible. There is a VLAN. So this one is on VLAN 720. That's my kind of storage network of sorts, but there's not DHCP. So let's go do that real quick. Not DHCP. Let's do manual. And let me check my notes on the other screen here. Double check, check, check. Yeah. Okay, so that will be 10. And this is it's not always intuitive if you've ever done some Linux setup before. So let me just do this here and make sure I get this right. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's just different. I'm used to the subnet masking, but this is different. So let me double check this once I get it all in.
All right, so let me look at this over real quick. Yeah, that should be all good. So let's go forth with that. And actually, one quick thing I can do here, so I can do a quick test here. Let's just double check that. And it's not working right now. Let me double check this here. All right, so you will figure this out too at some point, but again, I'm not a Linux expert, right? So I'm actually going to disable IPv4 here, right? And this is something that when I was preparing this, I may or may not have had to do it a few times. No, so let's do this over again. So let's go back over here on this interface, add that VLAN tag 720. And that's the one that's going to have the IPv4 config, right? So let's first of all make sure that's disabled. Good. Okay. I'm going to go back over here and go in here and say manual. And I'll do that bit that I had just there. That CIDR format. And then 231. And then that's the gateway. And the DNS. Let me check that over. And again, this is just because the way Ubuntu does its interface information on a VLAN, it sits like that. So it's applying those changes, and I bet I have some bacon now. Yeah, there we go. So good. So this is, by the way, a good thing to check, again, if you're using VLANs and the like. Okay. And I'm not using those other ones as much as they're going to try. All right. I do not need a proxy, but I will turn off access to the internet in a little bit. But after the install, I'll do that. At this point, I am going to pull down the latest stuff because it's going to ask for pulling an updated installer here in a second. There it is. All right. So let's update to the new installer. All right. So let's do this. This internet should be pretty good. Okay, so now the disk configuration comes up to be viewed here. So I'm going to use an, and notice the language, an entire disk. And I don't know if it knows just by first or whatever, but I like that it is taking that smaller one up first, okay, that SSD one that's just under 200 gigs. And I'm happy with that, right? I don't want to put it on the that much larger volume. That will be that XFS volume. That will be the where the Veeam backups go. So it's going to show me here a little bit more. So I'm going to look this over real quick here. So, and you know, again, I am not a Linux storage expert, right? And if you're watching this video, you probably aren't either. But I do know just by the geometry that the, let's see if I can scroll up there. The, you know, OS is going to install here, right? From what I said before. But over here, this is unused, right? I can create the partition now and format it as, let's see if I can do that now, format it as XFS. No, let's take it to XFS. And where am I going to mount it to? I want to mount it to another place. And I'm just going to call it, let's see here, VHR 01. Okay, so that's going to be the Veeam hardened repository 01. That'll be its kind of place on the file system. So we'll remember that. All right, so let's double check here. Yep, looking good. Looking good, right? And it's going to be XFS, that big target. All right, let's go ahead and make it down to the done department. All right. Yeah, it's going to do some stuff. Let's do it. All right, my name. So this is a good opportunity to document what you're going to do. And I would also highlight this will not be the single-use credential. This would be kind of a console admin only. So let me go check my notes real quick. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, and this is kind of a security practice you can take, and I don't have a specific recommendation. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. I'm just going to call it console user VHR01, okay? And then this will be the DNS name. So if you're using DNS, you potentially can just keep it without. Let's see here. This is going to match my environment here, and this will be TPM0L, that's L, dash VHR01. So long story, matches my setup. Now a username, okay, so this would be more of a username that you would log in as. So I'm going to put in here Vtron, and then I'm going to put a password for that. And this is going to be the one that we will do some post-install setup with. So let me, before I forget, let me take a screenshot, even though odd as I'm recording a video, but this is going to help me in some of the next steps as well. So we got that. Okay, so console user VHR01, server DNS name, pretty straightforward. Passwords. All right. Now, this one, we'll turn this off later if needed, but I am going to use this for some of the setup later, post-install. All right. Now, here's the other bit. I'm not going to take anything else, right? And there also won't be a window manager, right? So we're going to fall in love with the command line here. All right, so it's underway. It's doing its thing. It's doing some installs here, so we'll let it progress. And if it goes on for a while, I'll do a pause. So this is a good one here. So this step here at the bottom, downloading and installing security updates. During the install, connected to the internet, that's good, but later we're going to deconnect it from the internet, and we're going to add a step around doing updates off the internet. So it's just easier with the amount of updates to do it this way from the install. Okay, it says install complete at the top. It's not doing anything else, so let's go ahead and reboot now. So we'll let the reboot go. Okay, so yeah, unmount the CD. Yes, yes, yes. Doing it a different way, so that's why it's freaking out. So let's do that. There we go. So now it's going to reboot, and we'll come back up the first time. So I'll pause it through the reboot, and we'll log in and see how we look. All right, so we're booting up here. Many things are shown. Again, your environment may differ based on, the different hardware. And once this looks okay, we're going to switch consoles to get a better view. One thing I will say about the Ubuntu install process, especially if you're going to use it explicitly for the Veeam hardened repository, right? get some of these information points down first. Your IP, your network, get that all set, and then think about these users and account names, and then we're going to think separately about the single-use credential, right? So give some thought to that ahead of time. If you're like me, a lot of times in labs and stuff, you either follow something standard or you consistently do something non-standard. I recommend, and then have trouble maybe remembering what you did on that last scenario. So I recommend on this one, which is a pretty important one, right? The VHR. And by the way, you can see right around there it said mounted VHR 01, so that's a good bit. But anyways, you want to make sure that you know the explicit bits here for this particular system. So make sure we get the ping again. There we go. That's always good. But you know, especially the credentials and the path and all that, and then protect that information, right? That'll help you get this set up, because I don't want to quite call it set it and forget it, but I want to say it's very much a intentional setup, and then protect that configuration. So we'll let this continue to boot. All right, so we have booted up here, and what I'm actually going to do, the DRAC has done me well. I'm very happy with it, but I'm actually going to double check something over here. So we're going to go into PuTTY, and I'm going to skip DNS for now. I mean, honestly, you could even consider skipping it always, but as you can see, again, this is a lab. All right, so this, let's see if I see anything that I want to see here. This is the new connection here. Let me go back to my notes and get my username and password. Let's get Vtron, and let's go with the password I set, and we should be logged in. Okay, good. So this, at this point, and by the way, I don't know if you saw what I did there. I just did that real quick. One of the quickest way you can get into PuTTY and some other good things is, guess what? Right there in Veeam Backup and Replication. But anyways, I've got this system right here, and it should be pretty up to date, right? So we just did that update, and as we go over time, we'll see that change, of course. But at this point, the installation is complete. We're going to take a pause in the video series, and then we'll continue on with the next segment momentarily. Okay, in this session, this segment, I want to talk about the single-use credentials, which is one of the most important parts of using the Veeam hardened repository. So I want to direct you to Help Center, and when we jump in the lab, we're going to go right there to do that. But it's very important that the Help Center information is followed very specifically here, and I'm going to walk you through it. So you might remember when I did the install, I created those two accounts on the profile, Vtron and console user VHR01. I'm actually going to make an explicit separate account for the single-use credential, and I have that down there at the bottom, VHR SU account. Now, go back and forth on if you want to use something that's very describing or non-describing, but I'm at least going to use the VHR SU account for this, and I'm going to make a separate password. A separate password is the most important part. So let's jump into the lab and take a look. So where I am right here, I am in PuTTY, right? And I am going to go ahead and connect to PuTTY. And let me go ahead and log in, and then I'm going to make the screen a little bit bigger, the text and everything. So if you've not done this with PuTTY, you can actually do this real easy. First of all, I like the text a little bit different. So instead of that kind of boring gray, let's make it Veeam green, the bright one. Let's do that. And then the other thing is the appearance section. You can right here tell it to go to a newer font size. So it's on 10. I feel like 20 would be fine for what we're going to do here. Let's go ahead and apply that there. Yeah, much better. All right. So here we are. Now, I did mention we want to follow that hardened repository information in Help Center. So this is the page, and you know, this will probably be updated at V12 time, but there's immediate need for it now. So we're doing this with the version 11. So I encourage you to read through these three sections in particular right here. This is the most important part, right? So read through the three chapters of sorts of the hardened repository section, right? Because there's a couple of things like you can't do, where was it? It said reversed incremental you can't do, if I remember right. You can just like some kind of things make sense, right? You can't do that. Here it is, and the limitations and considerations. So give these some reads. For example, the let's see. For example, yeah, you can't use the reverse or forever forward incremental, right? So it's just a couple of points that you want to be aware of, right? Because the immutable attributes won't work with those disk I/O patterns. But default jobs, not an issue, right? So if you need a recommendation for like a backup copy job, no problem. And then a new backup job, no problem. So give this all a read. And then over here, it starts to get interesting. All right, so I'm not a Linux expert, but we're going to go through this together and we will get it. So what I want to look at first is, first of all, I actually need to create the account that I'm going to make. So I'm going to go over here, and the first thing I'm going to do, now I'm logged in as Vtron. That's okay. So what I'm actually going to do, first of all, is add this user, sudo add user VHR SU account. Now, in the blog post, I'm going to have some of these commands written that aren't in the Help Center, but I'm going to walk you through this straight away. So let's add this account. Here's my account to go into supervisor mode, sudo mode, and let's try it with the right account. There we go. Okay, and now I have a separate account for this one. Now, some people with Linux will do this with more specific information, and the other thing that other people might do is they will put this user with the add user command. They might put them in the sudo group, but I'm going to do this explicitly. So for example, so what this is I'm going to modify this user to the sudo group, add to the group VHR single use account. Okay, so this user now, and by the way, it's important if I want to highlight something, yeah, right here. Keep in mind that the hardened repository requires persistent data movers. The data mover to be persistent, you must specify a root level account. Okay, so that's why I added that user explicitly to sudo. All right, so I've got this user made, VHR SU account. He's gonna, this account is gonna be the one that I'll use over in Veeam when I get to it, but I'm not there yet. So over here, we have a couple of commands. So these are tips to enhance the security of the hardened repository. So we're going to go through that, and we're going to put that SU account into with these commands here. So let's go ahead and start doing that. Now, one of the things you can do here is actually copy the command. So here's the command. I'm going to copy it, but chances are, one of the things I don't like is that when you do copy it, it immediately enters it. Well, it's actually good. You see, it doesn't work. So I'm going to hit the up arrow and do this here. So the first thing we're going to do is make a path for this Veeam data mover. Okay. Then we're going to change the owner to the VHR account. So let's copy that, and we'll go in here. Same thing. Well, the text isn't right. I have to change it to VHR SU account, sudo. Let's do that correctly. There we go. And then this last one is to change the mode here. So I'm tired of it running automatically. So you'll see right there, it puts the enter in there. I'm just going to go like that. So I can do sudo, enter, boom. There we go. So these three commands, enhanced security tips for the hardened repository, have to be done. So you see that we've done this just as prescribed here, but give that a read. Now we're at the fun part. So now we're over here in deploying the Veeam hardened repository. So this is the part that starts to get pretty interesting. So let's get into this. So it has a couple of steps here. Let's prepare the directory on the Linux server for backups. I don't even need to copy that one. Let's go make a path. So here I am right where I left off, and I'm going to pwd print working directory, see where I am. I'm going to switch over to, you might remember that I made this VHR1 mount path, again, not necessarily standard, but I made this be that large XFS volume that I want the backups to go into. So what I'm actually going to do here is create the path I want to put the VHR in. So let's make a directory called VHR01 repo. Okay, and I gotta remember to start doing that. There we go. So there it is. VHR01-repo is a folder. So we're going to go over here. We've made that path clear. Now let's assign the owner. All right. Again, I don't like that running on its own. So let's do VHR single use account. And we've got that same command. Just because I know copy and paste is going to get me. Let's do that. And I'm going to, I got to change the path anyways. Didn't take the enter. And then VHR1. And there it is, VHR repo. You can use some tabs, little trick, if it's a pretty specific path. Should be straight away. Good. Now, again, change the access only to the owner and its root account. So let's go over here, do it this way. Nope. Again, copy and paste, change the folder, 700, and then back up. Bang, bang, boom. Okay, so I've changed those commands, those three preparations, and then this part is all in the Veeam infrastructure. All right, so this is going to be pretty straightforward, right? So let's go through it. I don't even need the user guide for this one because I know how to do this. So first thing we're going to do is add a Linux server. You can do it in DNS. You can do it with IP. I'm just going to do it with DNS or with IP. That's the IP I've been using through this, as you might remember. You know, go back and forth on that. I think as little interconnectedness for the hardened repository is a good idea, but I'll leave that up to you. So now we're going to add a single-use credential, and we're going to go with VHR single-use account. Let me check that password. And this is that same account we were just using in with the permissions and such. We don't have to change any of these other bits here. So let's drop it in. Okay, so the transport service, those persistent services will be installed. So let's let that progress. Yep, looking good. And it's a two-step process. I mean, it's documented here, which we'll come back to this, right? You have to add the Linux server, and then you actually have to create the repository. Okay, so there's two separate steps, but that's okay. This effort is worth it for sure. So there we go. We are good to go. All right. So now we go look at our actual backup repositories. These are those places that the backups go. And the hardened repository is of the type called direct attached storage, right? And so what happens here is we're taking that configuration that we've made and we're going to use it for the immutability configuration. I'm just going to call it VHR repo, okay? Any type of name, nothing fancy. And we'll find that Linux server, right? You can populate it if you want. It'll show you just a view of the storages here. There we go. Oh yeah, this is actually kind of interesting. So yeah, there's the VHR right there, that one at the end. And I mean, granted, this, like I said, was an older server, so it doesn't have a super large amount of space, but it's suitable for what I'm doing here. And it's very important on this next step that we select the right path so that it'll be the right file system, which I did select XFS. It made a default place here, which I don't like. We're going to change that. We are going to put it in that repo folder that we made. So again, just go through this very specifically. There you go. And that's the place we want to put it. That's interesting. Yeah, if you remember, anytime you add a repository, that default path is backups, right? So that storage matches what I want. And I'm going to drop in the immutability option. This is the part that really matters once we start putting in those immutable attributes. And really, the rest of this is a good default. So this is great. Let's, I don't know if you caught that. See if fast clone requirements are met. That is very important because if you want to use the XFS storage efficiency, right, we got to make sure that the version of Linux is right, the file system is right, and that in particular is why we are doing 20.04. Because if we had done a newer distro, we might have had a different outcome. And right here is also very important. This little step right here, if we didn't have the account and those permissions on the folder, right, this would have failed. And I can tell you from experience that I've just done it without doing those extra steps in the command line, and it failed right there. So if you ever are setting up the VHR and you get stuck right here, it's because that stuff in Help Center wasn't followed. Good stuff. Guess what we have now, friends? We have a VHR repository. So that was this module where we did a few things, right? We went through Help Center and we walked through the different configurations. And again, this part of the Help Center is very critical to getting a separate or like a successful outcome. And make sure that you have these user accounts and stuff like that documented ahead of time. So I knew when I went into this particular step that I wanted to have that VHR user account ready and that password. So those are the things that you want to do at this time. So in the next module, we're going to start doing backups, and we're going to then clean up some of the other things that I was showing about the updates and the internet connections.